Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. There are no fundamentals. There is only financial engineering, which is too bad for the real world, where the real economy and the real environment live, along with real people, right, Stacy?
Max, you are so real, making real sense.
I'm real. I'm realer than real. I'm so real.
Well, okay.
I'm keeping it real.
The first headline is, what's driving U.S. companies, fundamentals or financial engineering? Fiddling the figures, stock market manipulation is the subtext. That's a really nice look.
I got a real finger in my eyeball. It really hurts.
So Wolf Richter is looking at the markets. You know, they always continue to hit new time highs unless they've crashed. And what he finds is that it looks like a lot of fiddling and manipulation of numbers and financial engineering. Take IBM, for example. For years now, its earnings per share have increased steadily, even though its revenues have remained flat since 2008. It achieved this magical result by buying boatloads of its own shares to drive up the price. For example, in the first 6 months of 2014, IBM spent $12 billion on its own shares. It has spent $108 billion on share buybacks since 2000. So on the one hand, you know, this shouldn't be a problem if they were using retained earnings. But in fact, what they're doing is they're using debt inspired by the 0% interest rate policy, and they're buying their own shares with that. In effect, what IBM has been doing is liquidating itself, distributing the actual underlying value of the firm to shareholders via dividends and to executives via options, and replacing it with debt. It's precisely what many American households did prior to the 2008 crash by borrowing against the value of their homes and using it to splurge on vacations, boats, and RVs.
Well, you know, Stacy, they say that stocks climb a staircase and then fall down an elevator shaft. What does that mean? How does it relate to what you just said? Well, because the earnings that propel a stock's movement upward are incremental and the result of capital expense and management making good decisions, hopefully, and products being sold at a premium and marketing doing its job. And then when a market might get saturated, like IBM, for example, has been around for a long, long time, and it's kind of gotten very boring in their products. It's not like a whiz-bang, up, shook, boogie, and jive, new .com wonder net.7-94B stroke 10 company or anything like that. So what they do is they engage in tricks. They engage in little tricks like borrowing money to buy back their own stock. So their earnings look great, and the stock kind of climbs up a little bit. But at some point, though, the charade collapses, and all these stocks are exposed as really fraudulent accounting schemes, and the market pukes them up like bulimics backstage at a high fashion show, and just kind of spews out the stock price into a puddle of losses and tears.
Well, 0% interest rates are also causing junk bond investors, any investors, to seek yield. And one of the things they've been pouring money into is fracking, which is, again, actually liquidating the environment. It's just like IBM is using 0% interest rates to buy back the shares and liquidate their company. Here, we're liquidating the actual environment, the actual land, the geography of America in fracking. And our next headline regarding this is, fracking boom spurs demand for sand and clouds of dust. Sand production has more than doubled in the U.S. over the past 7 years. By the end of 2016, oil companies in North America will be pumping 145 billion pounds of it down wells annually. That's enough to fill rail cars stretching from San Francisco to New York and back. Now, the reason is sand is used in order to blast away, obviously, the sand, the rock down there in which the shale oil or the fracking gas is held.
Sand blasting. You know, it's used to, in this case, part of the fracking process. And the hoax of fracking, as we've been saying for a while now, is that it's cash flow negative.
Yeah.
That's the first point we should make. For every dollar of fracked revenue, they cost $1.50 in upfront costs. Now, the reason that this is being allowed to continue as such is that, well, you know, after 2 or 3 years, when all the sunk costs are behind these big frackers, they will have an unending stream of reserves to fill their coffers, and it's a viable business because in year 4, 5, 6, or 7, that's when the profits kick in. Oops, guess what? the average fracking rig only lasts maybe 3 years.
Well, as long as they keep on fracking, then they could pay the interest on the junk bonds that they're. So investors are attracted to the yield that they could get on the bonds.
This is the most insidious and gross aspect of fracking, is that the Ponzi scheme in this case, to pay the bondholders, the junk bondholders back, they need to go out there and exponentially frack more holes, bring in more trucks, sandblast more sand, use more scarce water, pump more carcinogens into the water table to create the Ponzi effect to pay off the junk bondholders. They need to keep exponentially fracking more. The fracking itself, the reserves are short-lived, the debt is never paid ever, and the environmental costs are enormous, extreme, and the infrastructure costs are out of this world because all these trucks that come in, they destroy the bridges, they destroy the roads. Who's left to pay that? The fracking companies? No, they declare bankruptcy and go off to some other Ponzi scheme. It's the local councils have to pay the taxes to pay for the frackers. It's completely subsidized. It's a freaking hoax.
On the one hand, according to this article, the sand companies are very happy. I think there's like 6 sand companies in the United States that provide almost all the sand to all these sort of companies. So they're doing well, they're happy, and perhaps they're hiring a few more people. So it might be good on that regard. But for those who live anywhere near this, and in this article, they talked to a guy in Texas who has a vineyard. Well, he's like bombarded with clouds of dust all the time. So they point out the health hazards of all of this sand and dust. The boom is triggering complaints from local communities, according to Grant Smith, Senior Energy Policy Advisor at the Civil Society Institute. Dust from sand can penetrate deep into lungs and the bloodstream. Mines consume massive amounts of water. Sand-laden trucks are damaging roads, and property values can be affected. The surge in mining is a little understood danger of the fracking boom, Smith said in a September call with reporters. So it's damaging the health of anybody who has to live near these places, even remotely, because the trucks have to travel a long distance to get there.
Right. All the easy fracking wells are already fracked out. We've hit peak fracking probably in the United States in the next 24 to 36 months. And all that's happened is that basically the concept of peak oil was extended by 3 or 4 years through fracking. It's not making America energy independent. It's not increasing American GDP for any sustainable way. And it's only increasing the ecological devastation, which is a huge cost that none of these companies are going to pay.
Well, as a result, gasoline prices are at multi-year lows. So that's another positive thing that people can look at. However, again, we've reached... all this cheap money has made everybody so inefficient and stupid, as you see from this headline. As pump prices tumble, gas guzzlers soar, and fuel sippers slide. A year ago, many industry analysts were proclaiming a dramatic and seemingly permanent shift to smaller, more fuel-efficient vehicles in a market where the mantra had traditionally been bigger is better. But such forecasts have flown out the window now that the price of gasoline has fallen to less than $3 a gallon in much of the country. So apparently, the sales of SUVs are soaring, the sales of electric and hybrid cars are plummeting as the price goes down. So people are just choosing to suddenly spend twice as much energy to get from point A to point B.
Right. We see that, people's, as we've said before, their contact with the economy is gas price. So that's how they orient their entire economic reality. And if the gas price is cheaper, they will go out and buy a big gas-guzzling SUV. If the gas price is higher, they'll change their behavior accordingly. There's no concept, however, about the ancillary costs that are being borne by these same taxpayers who are going to pay much more dollar per gallon in gas when you factor in the taxes that will be needed to be raised to pay for these frackers. So on an adjusted basis for environmental damage and other associated costs, the dollar of gas is not $3. It's $7, $8, $9 a gallon if you factor in the true cost. But of course, you would never get anyone to say that on American TV because they say you're anti-capitalist. No, I'm pro-reality.
And of course, so what they're doing is they're going back to old technology. It's 100 years old. The combustion engine has been around. It doesn't change much. Simple jobs that are easily displaced by robots, blah, blah, blah. Well, and it's also causing the loss of jobs in the sort of the more hybrid technology and all those sort of batteries and electric cars, that was creating much more value in terms of jobs. There were bigger thinking jobs that were creating more, knowledge economy.
Well, I'm not sure what's going on with Tesla, but they were going to start building massive production in the United States, not overseas. And they're also building a huge battery plant in the United States, not overseas. So hopefully Tesla won't be derailed by these lower gas prices, because that, in fact, would be a sustainable move forward.
By the way, I want to compare this also to the minimum wage, because a lot of people say, oh, if we have a increase the minimum wage, we'll lose jobs. Well, here, if you see this, if the cost of gasoline goes down and people just become more inefficient, all your cars are just taking you from home to Walmart, home to another, retail outlet. And you're just deciding to use twice as much energy because you're lazy, because the cost is...
Yeah, no, studies have shown that 80% of all traffic is within a 2-mile radius of one's home. So it's literally just people driving to the end of the block to put a letter into the mailbox and then driving home. I mean, that's most of the traffic that's born. People obviously are wasting huge resources by doing so and getting not the benefit of exercising as they would get if they simply walked down the block and put the letter into the post box.
So price signals can work in terms of encouraging behavior that creates more efficient traffic. That's supposed to be what capitalism is about. It's supposed to ever become more efficient, not less efficient.
Well, the minimum wage, it's been proven over and over again, is that it's actually, in the case of a restaurant out in Los Angeles called In-N-Out Burger, they pay much higher than the minimum wage, and the restaurant has higher productivity, higher return on capital, better customer retention, happier employees, less shrinkage, which is code for stealing, et cetera, et cetera. There's no argument that supports allowing minimum wage to drop, or it should be, in my view, be keeping up with money supply. That's how you need it.
Well, they're saying that if you have an employee that costs you $20 an hour versus one that costs you $5 an hour, well, the disposable $5 an hour person you don't invest in. You don't try to make them better at their job, more efficient, in order to get the productivity out of them. This is why we have the productivity conundrum that everybody has around the world. Is in the UK, wages have gone down from 540 pounds a week to 480 pounds, and yet productivity has collapsed.
I'm for capitalism, but not anarcho-capitalism. Anarcho-capitalism is psychotic capitalism, and one of the reasons this world is as screwed up as it is, because there's more anarcho-capitalism than people care to admit. But on that note, archaically or anachronistically, we must say arrivederci.
It just got so real.
Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to journalist and author Robert Chalmers. Robert, welcome to the Keiser Report. All right, this is, I've been waiting for this, very interesting, with a great anticipation. In 2005, Robert, you wrote an article for The Independent on the shameful secret history of Gary Webb, now the subject of a big Hollywood movie called Kill the Messenger. Tell us about Gary Webb.
Well, Gary Webb was a senior reporter on the San Jose Mercury News. And he was a man who had a Pulitzer Prize on his wall, an H.L. Mencken Prize. And then in the mid-90s, he kind of stumbled into a story via a drug dealer's girlfriend who rang him up, who said that her boyfriend was essentially being blackmailed by a dealer who had close connections with the CIA. Webb initially thought, that this was nonsense, told her to go away. She kept coming back, and eventually, he gave in and talked to her. And over the process of about 9 months, he disclosed and discovered papers that proved beyond doubt that the CIA were at least cognizant of the trail that sent crack cocaine into Watts and South Central LA. And this was important because, as you will be about to tell me, in the late 80s, in the Iran-Contra hearings, chaired by Kerry, everybody knew already that the CIA had been dealing with muddy peasants in fields in Central America, and that didn't bother them too much. But obviously,
Yeah, let me just jump in here for a second, because what's come out more and more with each passing year is that the CIA funds itself off the books by selling drugs.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is how the CIA gets around some of the budgetary restrictions, but supposedly they're supposed to be fighting stuff like narco-terrorism, and so their remit about being law enforcers, they're now the biggest crooks.
Yeah, and I think Webb was genuinely shocked by this. I mean, by the time I went over there in early 2005, he was already dead, which we'll come to. But he came home and told his now widow, Susan Bell, he said, "You'll never guess what I found out today." So he then went to his editor, Jerry Sepos, at Knight Ridder, who owned the Mercury News, which are a large journalistic group, as you'll know, and told him what he'd found. And in the summer of '96, the Mercury News ran 3 very long stories on this trafficking business, which really, it did shake the nation, I think, because it was possibly the first journalistic story really to go viral on the web.
All right, so Robert, you know, people criticize governments around the world, you know, that these journalists are disappeared, they're killed. Is it the same kind of people involved here? Because you've got essentially a corporate agenda, corporatists, and I remember Mike Hastings, journalist, got, I think, more overtly murdered and when he challenged the narrative of the Pentagon here in the U.S. But in Gary Webb's case, it wasn't like Michael Hastings, they just blew him up. There was more of a...
I don't believe Webb was murdered. I mean, I do believe that his death was indirectly caused by the authorities. I mean, what happened really was, you know, the normal due process that should be followed when a journalist has written an article, that is to say, he's challenged, you know, to the hilt by his editors, and then once they're satisfied with the copy, they'll defend him, you know, to the utmost. That didn't happen in the case of Gary Webb. He was essentially dispensed with, moved to a bureau in Cupertino, where his first job was to write the obituary of a police horse which had died of constipation.
Sounds like Boris Johnson.
Well, you know, it naturally wasn't exactly the area where he'd seen himself working, you know, when he set out. And, you know, there are various ways that Webb could have responded to that. He could have learned to teach English and moved to Burkina Faso and done an awful lot of good, you know, but what he actually did was to sink deeper and deeper into depression. He became toxic. You know, his widow showed me a file of 50 letters he'd written to smaller newspapers, including the Denver Post, pleading for just a routine job as a journalist. And in every case, he received either rejection or no reply. You know, so he got more and more depressed, drank more and more, smoked more and more. Split up from his wife, and in December 2004, he went back to the apartment where he was living, and on the 9th of December, he posted letters to all of his children and to his wife, saying what he was going to do, stuck a notice on the door saying, you know, call 911, do not come in, sat down, put on Ian Hunter's Welcome to the Club, drank half a bottle of bourbon, and put his father's 38 service pistol to his head. And, you know, that what brought him to that was what I don't think corporate lynching is too strong a term. I mean, every major newspaper in the United States, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, papers that consider themselves as beacons.
It's like he got blacklisted during the, you know, McCarthy period.
He said, you know, I became toxic. And, you know, that drove him into this depression, which led him to kill himself. The LA Times assigned, from memory, 17 journalists to look at mistakes in the grey area of, you know, the case, of which there were some. But there was a black and white binary truth, and that is to say, as the consensus today says, the truth of what Gary Webb said was correct. Even the CIA admitted this in their own report. I mean, it's a tragic story, but, you know, it does not absolve, as one security guy said to me, it does not absolve those from what they did.
Was there any indication that the CIA was surveying him?
I think there's every chance that they had been. I mean, I heard about this story first from a journalist called Paul Marrero.
Is there any reason to believe that he wasn't being continuously surveyed up until the day of his death?
I don't think they would have necessarily been too worried about that at that stage. I mean, just to go back to the means of death, because I think this is important. I mean, I had lunch last month with Dick Gregory, who your viewers might want to Google if they don't know who Gregory is, but a comedian,
big actor during the 60s,
activist,
human rights activist,
dietitian to Muhammad Ali, and that's just 3 things he did. And Dick still believes that Webb shot himself. There being 2 bullet wounds, it's not, you know, an unnatural conclusion to come to, but the first bullet went through his left cheek, the second one severed his carotid artery. I mean, I'm completely convinced that he shot himself, as are his family. Were the authorities in any way complicit in his death? I would say absolutely yes.
Okay, let's move on. You know, the way you're writing here, and bring CIA, conspiracy, drug dealing, you know, harkens back to the golden age of investigative journalists and Hunter S. Thompson, who you knew, you worked with, who is somebody that is sorely missed. That kind of gonzo journalism that we have to. That we had back then, and of course he armed himself, didn't he? I mean, you know, this is a guy who carried guns around, so if you kind of try to get after him, do we have any evidence of this surviving? I mean, when I read people like Matt Taibbi at Rolling Stone magazine, which was Hunter's, you know, shop, it reminds me a lot of Hunter S. Thompson and his approach, use of language, very, you know, as a skilled writer, very high literary talent plus investigative journalism. Do you see that any other than, let's say, Matt or others, any around?
You know, I can think of one prominent journalist here who I think believes he is Hunter Thompson and writes in that style. I mean, to be frank, personally, I can't imagine of a worse insult than being accused of trying to write like Hunter. But no, I think there's still tremendous spirit in writers over here, and I think his gift for sort of, I see him really as a great satirist. You know, I see his Nixon obituary, you know, as maybe one of his greatest pieces of writing. But just since you mentioned Hunter, I mean, just going back to Webb, I mean, I last saw Hunter Thompson in October of 2004. That's, what, 5 months before he shot himself. And we talked about Gary Webb. I mean, this is while Webb was still alive. I mean, Hunter, you know, his mind might have been somewhat impaired in some ways, but really, essentially, he was still all there. And then the reason I mention this is that the one American politician who really stood up for Webb to a point was Kerry, John Kerry. And while I was working on this piece, at the detonation of Hunter's ashes, I was stood at the alcohol-free bar holding my mint julep and turned, and Kerry was stood there. And I said to him, you know, listen, I'm working on this story on Gary Webb. Will you, you know, talk to me? And he said, yeah, sure, gave me his card. You know, nothing came back. And I talked to a senior security figure in America later who said, listen, you know, Kerry has worked out that if he wants his career to progress further as he would like, he's worked out that talking about Gary Webb on the record is probably not a particularly good thing for him to do.
Yeah, okay. Well, John Kerry is a salon monkey who we have no respect for whatsoever. Now, the CIA recently, you know, getting back to Gary Webb in this whole story, the CIA basically admitted the truth.
Yeah, they did in their own report. Yeah.
So, now, we also know that in Wachovia laundered $378 billion from Mexican drug cartels. And, of course, Wachovia was bought by Wells Fargo. The biggest shareholder is Warren Buffett. And we know that HSBC here in the UK has been caught laundering money for Hezbollah. Yeah. Royal Bank of Scotland caught laundering money for Hamas. Yeah. So the connection between banks, the CIA, foreign policy, militarization, and journalists, this Gary Webb story resonates, doesn't it? It
does. And I think it also speaks to a kind of sense of trust that you have, possibly mistakenly, in Western governments that you might not place in the governments of, say, North Korea or Belarus. You know, there's an underlying assumption that the United States would not be complicit in the murder of a journalist, directly or otherwise. And, you know, that then gets you to thinking, I mean, it made me question a lot of things. I mean, just before I wrote this piece, I was with the late Robin Cook. We were in a pub, Yorkshire, late on, recording device off. He turned to me and he said, you know, Robert, it took me and Tony a long time to work out.
Tony Blair.
Yeah, that we were dealing with a White House, and I quote, where the real power did not reside with the president. Now, I mean, that is, to me, quite a thing to say.
That's news to people around the world that Barack Obama is not the guy in charge, that it's really the banksters?
Obviously there he was talking about Cheney and Bush, but I think you could extend that now, and you do start thinking, there and here, are there powers that you, and this is what I'm coming on to, what it started me brooding on was, would it be possible for this to happen in the UK? Would it be possible for a British journalist to stumble on some story that was so explosive that it might put them in a place
Andrew
of
Gilligan
danger?
and the whole Hutton affair,
Well,
all those people were excommunicated, their journalistic careers destroyed for what turned out to be the truth.
The one I was going to mention was, you know, if someone, you go on the web, you put in Haute la Garenne, certain senior Tory ministers, Jimmy Savile, certain people still alive, and MI6 today. I think if a journalist did find that packet of lost documents, the smoking gun.
Right, they destroyed the documents.
I think they would have serious cause to worry for their safety. And without being a paranoid, you know, conspiracy theorist, I genuinely believe that.
All right, Rob, we got to call it there. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
No, thank you.
That's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Robert Chalmers, author and journalist. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.